Welcome, 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 everyone. You are listening to, you are watching, you are witnessing Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. Happy to be here today as I am joined and flanked, accompanied by my right-hand man who's actually sitting to my left, Mr. Davis Seaton. How are you?
What's going on? What's going on? Facebook Live, Intellectual Radio.
Absolutely.
What's going on?
Thanks everybody that's listening, no matter what medium you are using, whether it's IntellectualRadio.com, Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us. iHeartRadio, you got it. We appreciate your participation today, and we hope to find ourselves worthy of your time and viewership. So, Dave, we have a lot to talk about today. It's stunning because every week there's so many things that we don't get a chance to talk about because this Trump administration, as they say, is just taking up all the oxygen in the room. We've had a rash of school shootings this year, starting in January. I think we had 3 last week. And I'm talking 12-year-old shooters,
Correct.
15-year-old shooters. And something that's been different, we've had a couple of female shooters. But no one is talking about this. No one, and we really won't get a chance to discuss it in depth like we do. I just wanted to make sure that we at least brought it up so that people are aware that if you want to Google it and look up some of this information, we are actually having a crisis with we knew that anyway because we're a gun-loving country. But the school shootings are getting out of hand, and it brings particular attention to me because we hear so much about. But what about Chicago? What about Chicago? And these school shootings are happening in areas where the shooters aren't even black.
Correct.
And no one is talking about this.
Doesn't fit the narrative.
Right. Doesn't fit the narrative. These kids are not safe in their schools. They're actually being injured and killed in school. And it's not gangs, it's not drugs, and it's not minorities. But nonetheless, a lost life is a lost life. And I feel sorry for these people either way. But it just, again, that the fact that it flies in the face of the narrative that we're told so much about. But what about Chicago? Just adds an extra layer of context.
Just to add another level of irony, the city that is statistically per capita the most dangerous city to live in right now is Baltimore, Maryland.
Wow. What a segue. So that's a great segue. With that said, later in the show, we will be discussing the Baltimore Police Department, the corruption that is in the process of being rooted out. In that, we have an excellent guest, producer, reporter for HBO's Vice News, Antonia Hylton. She will be joining us for that discussion. She's going to help us lay out a context like you've never seen. She has spoken to victims. She's going to have victim impact statements. She's spoken to the district attorneys. She has spoken to literally everybody involved at every level in this process right now. So she's going to be, we couldn't have a better guest than we do for later in the show. The top half of the show, David and I are going to break down the Nunes Memo, what it means, what is it, the impact that it's having politically, internationally. And we just basically ask the question, are we in a constitutional crisis? And I've got a case to make out for the answer to that question coming up. Dave, any quick thoughts on that before we get started?
More importantly, about whether or not we're in a constitutional crisis, the question that we really need to be asking ourselves on the coattails of that is, if we don't change the Democratic Republican ratio of the House and or Senate, what's the end game? Where do we find ourselves in 2020 if the Democrats don't come out and take control of one of the houses in 2018 midterms this year?
Absolutely. Profound question, and we will definitely take a bite at that apple later in the segment. So again, if you don't know what the Nunes Memo is, we're going to tell you what it is, and to be honest, we're going to tell you why you should care, why it's important. So if you haven't gotten that information from us from your other local news segments, don't worry about it. We got you today on Humanity in the Headlines. David and I are both well prepared to give you that information, and we hope it's something that you find useful. So all we're going to do is take a quick break right now, gather ourselves. When we come back, David and I will break break down the Nunes Memo. Thank you so much for watching and listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. David, I got to tell you, bro, I'm excited about the whole show, period, but I'm excited about this segment in particular. Because this is, as political junkies, this is the upside to this is kind of stuff we live for, right? On average, politics can be kind of mundane. It can be kind of boring. It can be kind of tenuous. But, when it gets salacious, it can make things a little more interesting. And today is definitely where we are with that. So I'm excited about being able to break this down. If you could, Dave, let's talk about the facts. What is the Nunes Memo, generally speaking? And let's let our listeners who they're busy with their lives, with their jobs, taking care of their kids, they don't know. Let's go ahead and break it down for them what this is first.
The Nunes Memo, well, number one, Nunes, he is the Republican chair of the Intelligence Committee in the House of Representatives.
Devin Nunes.
So he came out, they've been going back and forth. They've been interviewing people. They've been trying to go, delve into this Republican or Trump-Russia collusion story. So Nunes, he's basically regarded as a lapdog for the Trump administration. So in an effort to try to derail the Mueller investigation, and Robert Mueller, however you want to pronounce it, he's the special counsel that is actually investigating the Trump-Russia issue and whether or not there was any collusion or obstruction of justice by the Trump administration. In the background, Trump has already fired James Comey. He already fired Andrea Gates, and he was rumored to have tried to fire Robert Mueller, but he can't do that constitutionally. He has to go through the deputy attorney general, who is Rosenstein.
Yes.
Rosenstein, because the attorney general recused himself, Jeff Sessions. So you bring that forward to Nunes. He came out and tried to put this story out that says that basically that all of the underlying intelligence that was used to start to begin to actually investigate Donald Trump was based on this dossier that was completely fictitious and that was funded by Hillary Clinton. So they came out with this memo that basically says, hey, we should get rid of Robert Mueller. We should fire all of the heads of DOJ and the FBI because they knowingly used this opposition research that was funded by Hillary Clinton during the presidential campaign in 2016 to try and get Trump out of office. And in the process of doing it, they got a FISA warrant to monitor a U.S. citizen, Carter Page.
What is a FISA warrant?
A FISA warrant is a warrant that you go to a special court, a FISA court, when you want to get a warrant from a judge to conduct surveillance. Generally speaking, FISA warrants are for foreigners. But in Carter Page's case, he was talking to Russians. He was going back and forth to Russia during the Trump campaign or during the presidential campaign, and while they were surveilling Russian foreign national, while they were surveilling Russian citizens, Carter Page got swept up. So they were listening to someone else. They were listening to somebody else who was a Russian spy, and then they caught that person on the phone with Carter Page. So then they went to a FISA court and said, this Carter Page guy is kind of unusual. We need to get a warrant to listen to him, and here's why. And the FISA court went ahead and said, okay, go ahead and do it. And they had to go back every 90 days to get this warrant renewed. So the Republicans are saying, specifically the Nunes Memo intimates that because they were using this dossier to monitor an American citizen, that it's proof of malfeasance in the entire investigation into the Trump administration.
Okay, so basically, it's a fruit of the poisonous tree argument. Right. So for those of you who watch Law and Order, I know a lot of you watch it. I'm sure you've seen episodes where the detectives may break into or go into someone's home to gather evidence, or they happen to go into the home for whatever reason, and while they're there, they come across evidence that completely implicates the person that they were looking at, but because they didn't have a warrant, that evidence gets thrown out, or because they didn't read someone their Miranda rights, the confession gets thrown out. They're trying to use that argument here that because the FBI used information from this dossier from Christopher Steele on Trump to obtain the warrant, then everything that has been learned from the warrants should not be applicable, right?
Exactly. And just to take it a step further to nail this down for our listeners and for our watchers, this would be like if I called the police and I said, Atiba Buchanan is selling meth. He's got a meth lab in his basement. And then they break into your house and they don't find a meth lab, but they find some cocaine. And then you say, well, hey, you came in here looking for meth, number one, so you can't bust me on the cocaine. And number two, David called the police on me. He doesn't like me. You can't use it. You can't trust him. He doesn't like me. Of course he was going to call the police and tell him I'm selling cocaine.
Excellent. So that's generally what the Nunes Memo is. So let's talk about the process then. And before we get to that, let's talk about, because you called Nunes a Trump lapdog. So let's substantiate that. Where do you get that assertion?
Well, Nunes already going back to the original story that they were trying to use before they were trying to use this whole warrant thing. They had come up with this other story a few months ago, and the facts of the story are less important than the chronology of what happened. Nunes came out to the press and said, hey, I've got this information and I'm taking it to the White House to let them know that, that A, B, and C is going on that's trying to destroy the president. But then it came out later that the information that he said he was taking to the White House, he got from the White House. So he's already, and that was originally the reason why the intelligence, he had to recuse himself as being the chair of this particular intelligence committee, which makes his involvement now all the more suspect.
And we're going to bring that up later too, because that actually plays a narrative into the bigger question that we're asking today as to whether or not we're in a constitutional crisis. So let's talk about how the memo came. Now that we know what the memo is, let's talk about the process then as to how it got through Congress and then through the president.
There are there's one fewer member of this committee that represent the Democrats and the Republicans. So whenever you have a committee, whoever is the political party that's in charge, if you have 12 people on a committee and the Republicans are in charge, they won't have it 6-6. They'll have it 7-5, or there'll be an odd number. It's usually an odd number. So there'll be 13 people, and then 7 of them will be Republican and 6 of them will be Democrat. Same thing if it was the Democrats in charge, it would be the same thing. So in this particular scenario, we've got the Republicans who are in charge of both the House and the Senate, and on this Intelligence Committee, there's one more Republican vote than there are Democratic votes. So the Republicans got together and got this memo together and said, hey, we're going to release this memo. The Democrats said, hey, your memo is full of holes and factual inaccuracies and omissions. We want to put our memo together also and deliver it at the same time. And the Republicans said, well, let's vote on our memo first. All the Republicans who are in favor of releasing our memo say aye. And of course, all the Republicans voted yes. And because the Democrats have one fewer vote, all of the Democrats voted no, but it didn't matter. So then those same Republicans said, okay, we're putting out our memo. We agree. All Republicans in favor of releasing the Democratic memo say aye. And all of them said nay. So then they said, we voted, and the majority won. So the Republican memo came out because they're trying to set a certain narrative, because they're trying to set things in motion to give Trump or give the White House enough operating space to move on the people that they want to move on. And again, if you listen to the Republicans, they make a very impassioned plea to say that this memo proves that there's all this malfeasance in the FBI and the DOJ, and that the Mueller investigation, all of this is just, no pun intended, trumped up to trip up the president, and is based on this faulty intelligence. But even if that's true, and if they have the courage of their convictions and they believe the facts are on their side, why not release the Democratic memo simultaneously? If they believe that the Democratic memo is going to be false and that it's going to fall under the weight of its own inaccuracies.
There you go. So let's fact check the memo a little bit then. So, I was able to pull up some information, and there are a few claims in it. Well, first of all, let's talk about the main goal of the memo. The main goal of the memo, again, is to muddy the waters, so that one of two things happens. Either they can, as you said eloquently, they can, the president can then move on the people that he needs to move on. What that looks like is Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general, because if he's able to fire him, because he's the only person able to fire Mueller and put someone in his place that is a Trump lapdog, then that would be the person to fire Mueller. But let's say he doesn't do either of those things. At bare minimum, what they're hoping then is to shape the narrative such that when the investigation is completed by Mueller, that it is now discredited, that the sources that were used to come up with this information, and a lot of it will come from the dossier, which kind of spurred everything. But again, all the dossier did was open the door. And then once Mueller walked through the door, then he's, like, as you said, he was looking for meth, but then found cocaine. Asked Paul Manafort, exactly. Asked Michael Flynn.
Exactly.
So with that said, they're looking to discredit everything, so that at bare minimum, if and when there are findings that are disfavorable to the president, people are able to go, and have a collective shrug. With that said, let's talk about some of the things that we expected to be in it that weren't, because the Department of Justice, the FBI, all of these entities were concerned that releasing this memo would reveal sources
and methods,
and that ultimately those things would help our adversaries, mainly Russia. Did the memo accomplish that?
It did, in the respect that, and this is the one thing that the Republicans keep trying to skirt around. Carter Page was originally under investigation going back to March, April of 2017. The memo didn't come out until the late summer of 2017. So again, the chronology doesn't even make sense, that they would say the dossier was the reason that they started to investigate Carter Page, when the investigation of him predates the memo or the dossier by at least 4 to 5 months. But the issue becomes, now Russia or whomever, they can backtrack and go back to March, April of 2017 and say, okay, this is when we talked to him. This is who talked to him. And then they can get their story together and say, oh, no, that's not true. It was, we were just at the local 7-Eleven in downtown St. Petersburg, and they bumped into each other over slushies. And, that's how that happened.
And then it also gives Russia the opportunity to figure out who was surveilled.
Exactly, because a lot of the undercurrent of this is that we've got, or what's being kind of whispered in the media, they haven't come out and said it, but the whispers going on in the media is that all of this really means that the United States might have a mole or moles within the Russian government. So now, if Russia can go back and they can put together who was around, who was talking to Carter Page, who was, that's the part that Russia hasn't been able to figure out. So if they can, but now that this FISA memo or this Nunes memo has been released that has all of this information from the FISA court, they could conceivably identify moles within Russian or United States spies that we have within the Russian government, and either start giving those people disinformation, or worse still, they could just kill those people.
Right. So, with all of this said, with all of this effort that has been put into trying to discredit the investigation, the president is of the mindset that he's been vindicated, that the investigation, Mueller's investigation, should be over. He's been vindicated. Sean Hannity has said as much, and I'm trying to figure out, is that where we are? Has the president been vindicated, and should the Mueller investigation, has it been impacted in any way?
There's nothing in the Nunes memo that has any implication on the Robert Mueller investigation whatsoever. I did note, however, when I saw Trump, he tweeted this morning, and Trump talks and tweets like he's a 16-year-old Valley girl. He was like, I'm totally vindicated, dude. I'm totally vindicated. But then he has a sentence. There's a sentence in his tweet where he mixes up their THEIR and THERE.
Right.
So on top of him being guilty, he's an idiot.
So let's talk about this. Let's finally go ahead and just ask this question. And I'm actually going to answer it first, if you don't mind. Are we in a constitutional crisis? Is that hyperbole? Is this Chicken Little, the boy who cried wolf? The answer is no. The answer is yes, we are in a constitutional crisis, and no, this isn't hyperbole. We really are. Let me make the case for it. We've actually been in a constitutional crisis for much longer than we realize. This is helping to crystallize it. But if we really want to be technical, we've been in a constitutional crisis ever since the inception of the Trump presidency. We've been in a constitutional crisis ever since Trump refused to remove himself from his businesses. So now we're looking at 150 plus days of him visiting a Trump property since he's been president, making money off of his properties as president, doubling his fees as president at his properties, having taxpayers pay for all of these exorbitant security fees at his properties for his families. We've been in a constitutional crisis. Things that we have that would have been completely abnormal, we've began to see as normal. To be honest, we've actually been in a constitutional crisis. You can go back even further with Neil Gorsuch, because when Republicans didn't allow a sitting president to have his own constitutional allowed pick for the Supreme Court, and there was nothing that was done about it, we've actually been in a constitutional crisis since then. So the thing is, the Constitution was not designed to fail all at once. We have seen a slow chipping at the Constitution, at things that were considered abnormal that have now been normalized. So yes, we are in a constitutional crisis because we're in a space now where laws are only as effective as their enforcement. And we're in a space now where the president, the executive, is now able to do things that he is not empowered to do, and that Congress has absolutely no checks. You want proof? Here's proof. Earlier this month, Congress approved sanctions against Russia to the tune of like 98-2.
It was 98-2 in the Senate, and it was 427-2 in the House, something like that.
Thank you. Overwhelming consensus, something that we never find in the Congress. The president was supposed to then, this is a veto-proof consensus on what he's supposed to do in enacting sanctions against Russia. What does the White House do? Nothing. They ignore Congress's vote. And what's being done to remedy this? Nothing. That right there is a constitutional crisis. So we've been there. And now this is just further evidence of the slow erosion of the powers, of the slow erosion of the checks and balances in our system that are supposed to occur.
Everything you just said is incontrovertible. I can't disagree with any of the points that you made. The distinction that I'll make is that we have constitutional norms and then we have constitutional laws. For example, Donald Trump refused to show his taxes. That had become that had become a norm, because going back to the 70s, every presidential candidate disclose their taxes. And the reason behind that was because of full disclosure, because you didn't want there to be any ability for the president to take advantage of his position. You wanted to have all of that information out there. But that was never a law. That was a norm. And when Trump didn't show his taxes, I'm sure he spoke to his attorneys, and his attorneys were like, "It's not a law." He was like, "Okay, I'm not going to do it." He was just brazen enough to be the first person to do it. And again, the system wasn't, to your point, the system wasn't prepared on how to react, because it had become a norm. The fact that here's the point when we will know that we actually have that the Constitution, or that we have a constitutional crisis. This is when we'll have one. If Trump's approval continues to stay where it is, and I have every confidence that it will, if Trump continues to break these norms and continues to do these things on Twitter and continues to do everything that he's doing, and the Democrats get control of the House, and they bring him up on articles of impeachment, which they will, and if there are enough votes in the Senate to actually convict him, and Trump doesn't leave the White House, and then the Congress doesn't respond, that's when we'll know that that he has broken the actual constitutional law. Because I can't say with a high degree, I mean, Trump, I could see Trump getting impeached and sitting in the Oval Office and telling the Capitol Police, or telling his security to protect him and don't let the people come in there and arrest. I could see he would have to get dragged out of the White House.
Literally.
That's when we know that's when we'll be at the actual breaking point. We're not at a crisis point yet, because there are still some procedures out there that can remove him. So that's the only distinction that I would make, is that the main thing that Trump is guilty of is that he has broken so many norms that we had just been abiding by for so long, that a lot of people just assumed that they were laws.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I tell you this, there'll be laws by 2020. I'll bet you that.
The Republicans are just so nakedly transparent. When President Barack Obama became president in 2008, and he had written a book 2 years prior, the Republicans, the minority were telling him, "Hey, we're going to bring you up on the emolument," and they were in the minority.
Right.
And they were making noise about him violating the emoluments clause because he was accepting money from a book that he had written 2 years before, that in their eyes he was capitalizing off of because he became president. So he just voluntarily just say, "I don't even want the drama." So he just gave the money away, even though he knew that he probably was well within his rights and was well within the confines of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, because he adhered to the norm. He didn't even push the envelope. But to your point, Donald Trump is pushing the envelope wherever he can for his own personal gain, because there's a really interesting, and we usually don't do this. I usually don't do this, but if you for all of those out there who watch Netflix, there's a show called Dirty Money, and the 6th episode on that is about Donald Trump. It's called The Confidence Man. If you get the chance to watch that, please watch that, and that will put a lot into perspective about Donald Trump and his presidency.
So let's wrap this up. As again, time is always against us. As we near the end of this segment, Dave, what are the remedies? What do we need to do? Can anything be done to get out of this situation?
The only thing that we can do, which is the only thing that the only remedy that we have, is the remedy that we have always had, and that's voting. We have got to make sure that in 2018 that we introduce some checks and balances into the system, because it is painfully apparent that the Republican Party is so partisan that they are not going to hold Donald Trump accountable for anything. Now, the irony is is that if you do give control to the Democrats and they to the Democratic Party in either house, and they do start to hold him accountable, that's going to that's going to add some credence to Donald Trump's assertion that see, everybody's against me. I'm not paranoid. Everybody's just against me, So again, but we can't allow his ability to manipulate people emotionally. We can't allow that to keep us in this apoplectic place where we don't hold him accountable.
There it is. 2018, folks. That's where it's at. We got to get out in the midterms. We just cannot show up for the presidential election. This is as serious and as dire as it has ever been. Go out and vote. Tell everyone you know that has the right to vote to get out and vote. And we've got to take the House back. We've got to take the Senate back. We have to get it in the powers into the hands of people that will exercise the checks and balances that are in place. Those checks and balances are only as good as the people that are there to enforce them. Just because it's on paper doesn't mean a whole lot if no one's there to enforce it. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will be joined by Antonia Hylton to discuss corruption in Baltimore PD. You do not want to miss this conversation. Thanks for listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. That was an amazing first segment, Dave. Great job.
To you as well. That's a hot story.
Absolutely. So something that is just as hot, but I promise you, underreported, under-discussed, underappreciated, is the corruption that is being unearthed in the Baltimore Police Department. Now,
not the Baltimore Police Department. The Baltimore Police Department?
Yes. I was just about to say, we've been here before. Names like Freddie Gray immediately come to mind. No one being held accountable despite 6 arrests, I think, in that case.
6 officers, yes.
All types of mistrials and not guilties and whatever you want to call it. No one was held accountable for a poor man having his spine severed in a police ride that was arrested really for no reason. We're talking about a community that is really living in a police state. We're talking about a community that has seen its trust degraded with police to record low levels. And now finally, maybe there might be a change in this. Joining us to help give us some context, to help give us some perspective. David, I'll go ahead and let you give the introduction.
We're going to have today joining us is Antonia Hylton. She's a correspondent and producer at Vice Media on HBO. She is a graduate of Harvard University with a B of A, and she is a magna cum laude. So I'm really looking forward to talking to her today. Antonia, how are you?
I'm so great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to have this conversation about all of the crazy things that are happening in Baltimore right now.
If you could just, for our listeners, because again, the national news has consumed so much of what we see. So if you could just give kind of encapsulate in maybe 2 or 3 minutes to our listeners, what's going on with the Baltimore Police Department right now, and kind of bring us up to speed.
So here's what's happening in Baltimore. 2 police officers are on trial right now. A guy named Detective Danny Herschel and then Marcus Taylor. And they're two of what used to be a 9-member elite squad. So not just your regular everyday officer, like these are the guys who got the promotions. These are the guys who were well respected in the department. And they were part of a group called the Gun Trace Task Force. And federal, they're now under federal indictment. And 2 officers are fighting the charges, the 2 I just mentioned. 6 have pled guilty. And 1 in the squad so far hasn't been charged with anything. But it really is some of the most wild misconduct imaginable. What the trial has revealed, we kind of get crazier and crazier details every day. And what the indictments in their many pages show is that this sort of elite squad, these 8 guys, were charged with or tasked with doing what is really important police work, getting serious and illicit firearms off the street, trying to disrupt sort of criminal networks, but instead they literally did those acts themselves. I mean, some of the wild anecdotes off the top of my head, I mean, these guys were seizing tens and tens of thousands of dollars off of people in the community with sort of no pretense, under who they got searched and seized property from for completely illegal, non-existent purposes. And they really were just going out there and committing sort of the exact same crimes that they had been trusted by the department, by the community to fight. And so you sort of mentioned this as well, this sort of breakdown in trust that has started in Baltimore years ago, but now is really reaching this fever pitch because, you know, in the wake of Freddie Gray and with the consent decree and all of this talk in the city about rehabilitation, Baltimore trying to fix its image, it is really crazy to see this trial going forward and finding out the sort of deep, deep levels of corruption among some of the most well-respected officers. I mean, these are guys who went on the stand and who have testified against other people. You know, these are people who the state's attorney's office had trusted and had considered their word to be gold. And now we're finding out that they were gang members, essentially, that they were dealing drugs, that they were robbing people, and putting the communities that they were supposed to make safe in extreme chaos and danger. And so really everyone should be tuning in right now because the only reason we know about this entire thing, right, is because there was a federal investigation and an indictment. So we don't yet know how far this corruption goes, who else may have been involved with these 8 guys, and what we're going to find out by the end of this trial.
Listening to you, and listening to you give that synopsis, and thank you, and just on reading it, it reads like the entire Baltimore Police Department it sounds like a training day, or it sounds like that show the Siege, where basically cops are just going up to police officers just going up to drug dealers and saying, how much money do you have on you, and just taking their money and taking their drugs, and then telling them, well, who else, you know, if I wanted to get $100,000 to this afternoon, who would I hit? And then they tell on somebody else that they know is another drug dealer, and then they go rob that person. And then when these drug dealers were brought in and immunized and they were coming in to testify, they basically said we couldn't do anything, like we can't call the police on the police for robbing us for doing something that was illegal. So that's basically how the police got away with it this long.
In the piece that I did for HBO, I spent some time with a gentleman named Sean Whiting, who had been involved in some drug dealing several years ago, but a bunch of officers stormed his home and seized money from him, seized property that belongs to his children, things that have absolutely nothing to do with whatever crimes they may or may not have proof he committed. And he submits an internal affairs complaint to the city, outlining how he's been robbed, being very honest that he even has said to me, you know, like, I'm no angel, but here's what these officers did to me. Their word can't be trusted. My case needs to be thrown out. And, you know, this guy just got out in November. He spent 3.5 years behind bars, finally released because of these indictments. When you look at a case like Sean Whiting's, he did, you know, he was at home, inside his home, and had his home stormed by these men under, again, sort of wishy-washy pretenses. And you wonder, A, how many Sean Whitings there are, and then what the effect of that is, right? You know, you multiply them by whatever factor, and you realize that there are entire neighborhoods where if something really bad happens, they're not going to call 911. They're not going to step forward and say that they're a witness to a crime. They're not going to help and feel like there's a collaborative relationship with the city, with prosecutors, with the police. And that makes everybody in every part of the city, anybody who touches Baltimore at all, less safe. And who's responsible for that? I think, that's not to say that Sean Whiting would say that he never did anything wrong, but certainly when the police don't investigate crimes properly, and certainly when they completely disregard people's constitutional rights, there ends up being this complete anarchy, and there can be no justice while people just believe that that their word doesn't matter, and that there's no shot that the truth will come to light.
Antonia, this is Atiba. And again, we thank you for being on today. This has just been very, very enlightening. I'd like to ask you, where was some of the oversight missing? Is this something that the mayor overlooked? Is this a matter of something within the police department itself, or a combination of the two?
Well, I would bet that it's a combination, and a lot of reporters, a lot of people on the ground are trying to figure out the answer to this question. The sort of first answer would be, it's the commissioner's responsibility. Commissioner runs the police department. They are familiar with these guys. They, sort of are the ultimate place where there's responsibility, but certainly the mayor is in communication with the commissioner. And I think that's why you see, we saw just the other day, Commissioner Davis get fired and replaced by Commissioner D'Souza. Another piece of evidence that things are a little unstable right now in Baltimore when it comes to law enforcement and trust. But certainly, with the rising murder rate, with this entire scandal going on, there seems to be a sense when you talk to community folks, when you talk to reporters, and then when you watch the city's actions, that people really believe that there are some folks higher up the chain who either knew or should have known, certainly didn't carry through the responsibilities that they were entrusted with. And that's one of the things I think people are looking for in this trial. And one of the reasons why I urge listeners, viewers to tune in and follow local reporters on the ground in Baltimore to really look every day and see some of the details coming out about this, because we're all trying to find out how does this go and who was responsible. Because, there's that question, was it just 8 guys who happened to be doing all this brazen misconduct, or and who all happened to coincidentally end up in the same task force together, or were they promoted into that task force by people like them? That's sort of the question mark right now, and we all want to know.
And as I'm listening to you, I'm remembering another part of the story where they were talking about how the police officers in this particular crime unit, they would carry guns or toy guns, so that if they got into a shooting situation with a citizen, they could plant the gun. And then the story comes out, oh, he had a toy gun, and it was dark, and they thought it was a real gun. Yeah, so we know we've heard that before. Let me ask you, because you made a really interesting point. When you say right now they're trying to figure out how far up this goes. My impression is that usually when stories like this break, people are just aghast. They just can't believe that there was corruption in an entire police department. How could that be true? Because we're always told that, the police are here to serve and protect, and that the vast majority of them are good people, and it's just a small percentage of bad guys out there. But it's always been my contention that if you've got 8, because I looked up, Baltimore has about 3,000 police officers in their entire department. If you've got 8 police officers who are out there conducting themselves this way, it's impossible that no one else on the police force is aware of what they are doing. And it's also my contention that those people who know and turn a blind eye are just as guilty as the officers who are out there who are actually committing these crimes. What are your thoughts about that in terms of this problem is so much bigger than the narrative that we're given, that, oh, you got to trust the police because they're there to help you and protect and serve, and how that's not true?
I think, you are certainly not the first person who has expressed those feelings to me. And you can just look, if you comb through the pages of the indictment, you'll see that for every big scandal and incident, robbery, crazy, wild things from the training day that these officers did, you can see the initials of other officers who we don't know yet, who we haven't been identified, who haven't been up on the stand yet, who haven't been charged with anything. And there are lawyers, some of them featured in my piece for HBO, who are finding out who those guys are, who are trying to get court orders to have their internal affairs files released, and who are going to be trying to build a web right now of, who were all of these 8 guys' friends? They worked with different people. Just because you're on one task force doesn't mean you spend every day and every assignment was just the folks on your task force. You work and collaborate with people across the department. So who else was with them when they robbed X thousands of dollars from Joe Schmo? Who else was with them when they used illegal GPS tracking devices to follow around people they suspected of being drug dealers or having high amounts of cash on them? Who else was there when they stormed somebody's home without any permission or cause whatsoever to enter? There are lawyers, there are reporters right now who are pulling all the strands they can find and putting that together. And, of course, the police department is going to continue to say, and many officers are going to continue to say that the vast majority of us are good. We don't know how this happened, and we're too trying to figure it out. And there's really only one way we'll be able to definitively answer that question, which is by getting access to some of these files, the public coming forward, reporters coming forward, and really demanding that there be sort of this full truth and reconciliation, right? Full acknowledgement, and that there be cooperation to go back into some of these cases and review who knew what, when, and why didn't we find out sooner. That's the only way we'll know for sure. But I think some people see this trial as the real opportunity for justice, right? Because as you mentioned, a lot of folks feel like they didn't see that with Freddie Gray. But now we have all these officers on trial. Now we have all these officers who are pleading guilty and copping to what they did. So as we get that testimony, as we find out the truth, maybe this is a real moment where people are going to begin to say, I told you so, and next time you're going to listen to me.
Antonia, this is Atiba. I'd like to take a moment to talk about some of the unintended consequences of this. As I think in some of your reporting, you spoke with the district attorney who now has to evaluate thousands of cases that these officers might have tainted. Can you talk about some of the effects of that?
So yeah, in the piece, I spent time with two attorneys. One is a public defender, a Maryland public defender named Deborah Levy, and the other is an attorney named Ivan Bates. And they both represent folks who've had cases completely botched by one or multiple members of the gun trace task force. And they have a huge a pile of work on their hands, to just put it simply, particularly Deborah at the public defender's office. She has what she thinks is a conservative estimate of 2,000 cases to comb through right now. Just these 8 guys may have created 2,000 miscarriages of justice. And so and again, that's a conservative estimate. So she has a mountain of work, and every day she's trying to get someone from the prosecutor's office to come over and sign forms to wipe someone's record out. She's trying to get people expungements. She's getting calls and letters that she showed me on her desk of people saying, hey, I've seen this in the news. This happened to me too. What can you do to help me? Because many of the folks, remember, in these communities, these are low-income people, Black and brown people who are sort of historically marginalized in Baltimore, whose voices haven't been heard. They don't have access to a ton of funds, a ton of connections who are going to help them get the best lawyers in town. A lot of folks assume that they are criminals in some way or another, so they're, the benefit of the doubt is not on their side. And so it's an uphill battle for them getting in touch with these folks to get the help. And then any single lawyer like Deborah is the only person in that office right now handling those thousands of cases. She said to me, she's struggling to sleep at night because every moment she feels like she needs to be working towards getting someone else free. Because right now these guys are on the stand, but there are still people sitting in jail, sitting in prisons because of the work that they did, right? And that is just going to, unfortunately, be a one-by-one process. There's no easy button to click to do mass exonerations and set everyone free just because they interacted with this one guy from the gun trace task force. You got to go back and you got to comb through every single case and work with all of those individuals to get it done. And it's not going to take just one week, 1 month even, or 1 year. I think it's going to be a while before all of this is cleaned up.
Antonia, this is David again. I'm listening to you, and we've had this conversation so many times on Humanity in the Headlines. And I'm listening to you. People's lives are being ruined. They're going to jail. They're losing their jobs. They're losing time with their families, with their children. They're losing just the ability just to live their lives on what could, and they could be 100% innocent. And then when they do, if they get out of jail, They've got to rebuild their life. I mean, there's so much destruction, and as you said, this is happening in Black and brown communities. Is it? And I have a very specific thought pattern about how to address this. But let me just ask you, just in what you've seen, is it time for us as an African American community to just come to the conclusion that we're not going to find justice in the justice system as it pertains to police misconduct in our neighborhoods?
You know, I think that's a really upsetting question to try to answer, because I would hate to it's hard to answer because there's one answer I hate to give, and there's another that I feel is not completely accurate, right? You know, I think we've seen and that there are Black and brown people are sort of at this moment right now where we never before we've known these things, but we're now seeing the evidence of it. Not just because these men are on trial, but because there's cell phone video, because body cameras are showing them planting drugs on folks. So we have all this stuff that's backing up what before a lot of people thought African Americans, Latinos were paranoid about. They didn't listen, but now we have the evidence. And we have yet to see that evidence, that those videos, that the body cameras, that they're leading to a massive amount of change. At the same time, I don't want to say completely disregard the justice system. You know, we do have good officers. We do need people to go through due process and the proper legal system. I don't think there is a way to exist in this country without interacting with it, without having some sort of relationship to it, and ideally working within your community to build up the kind of trust and build up the kind of communication with those agencies that means that when you need something and the people you love need something, that you have them to rely on, right? But I do think that this is a huge cautionary tale. I do think the last several years in Baltimore have been a cautionary tale, and that anyone who's paying attention, who's seeing the devil in the details on this one, they do need to really be careful and think sort of about what they can do in their communities to ask for better accountability and to create a better culture of justice and policing. And they do again have to think of it as a bit of an uphill battle, right? You know, they're going to have to fight for the access to that evidence, to those internal affair files, and they're going to have to think about ways in which they can push elected officials to do more for them. Because I think without that, we'll find ourselves a few years back in the same story.
But you know what, you used an interesting word, and again, I know we're getting toward the end of the hour, but you used an interesting word, and I want to just make sure that I illuminate that just for a moment. That you used the phrase due process, and due process is there to make sure the system was designed so that if you committed an offense, that you are brought into the system by the police department or by the police part of our justice system, and then you go through the system, be it the courts or jail or you know, whatever. But the system was never set up. The system does not have a corrective mechanism in it when you wind up entering into the criminal justice system based on erroneous or false information. There is no corrective method there. That's why you said it's taking months and years for people to get their lives back together, because the system is set up and it's based on the assumption that if you enter the criminal justice system, that the police and the forensics and everything was above board and that they were honest and truthful. But if all of that information that puts you into the pipeline, into that system, if all of that information is false, there really is no mechanism in the system to correct that.
Right. No, we were watching that mechanism. You can see that mechanism in the piece, right? That is a good-hearted person doing the research, doing the work to go back one by one and try to undo it. And whether that's through some change in DNA evidence, or honestly, more frequently, it really is doing the work that Deborah Levy and attorneys like her are doing, which is getting all the files you can and piecing all the testimony you can together and coming up with a real version of what happened, going to court, showing that what you know to be the case is what happened, and having to get people exonerated based on that. I think
and right, don't
come with it.
Right, and don't misunderstand my premise. I believe the work that you're doing and the work that your team is doing is excellent and is necessary. But the reason why what you're doing is necessary is because we have a flaw in the system that allows people to be that allows people to be erroneously incarcerated and charged in the first place.
You're right, and that should alarm everyone in every city, not just people living in Baltimore. And I think the next phase of this has to be A, how do we do mass exonerations better? B, how do we build departments where doing things like this and having to undo the work of really malicious and corrupt individuals never has to be the case again. And then, how do we vote people into office or shape laws so that the voices of people in the communities that are at risk of all of this are taken more seriously and they get a fairer trial. I think those are all the layers that we need cities like Baltimore to follow through on. And it'll be really interesting to see if the will is there to do it.
Antonia, this is Atiba. As we come to a close to this segment, there's just one more question I'd like to ask you. If you could just give us an assessment of your level of confidence that these officers will be held accountable and that there might be change now headed for Baltimore.
So my level of confidence is on the officers that are on trial right now. I think they're all very likely to face serious time. I mean, they're looking at decades in prison. The evidence is very strong against them. So I think these officers, justice is likely to be served, highly likely to be served. But when it comes to reform in Baltimore, I have a little bit less confidence on that. I mean, people have been talking about change in Baltimore. They've been talking about crooked cops in Baltimore. They've been talking about better accountability, transparency, bringing down excessive force, and kind of goes in a circle. And administration after administration, the same conversation happens. Maybe some change on paper comes through, but we still find ourselves right now in 2017 or 2018 looking at a trial that is like something out of a movie. And I think it remains to be seen if the will is there to really do it this time. Right now, I'm not they're doing the right things on paper, which is something that Baltimore Sun reporter Justin Fenton said to me several weeks ago when I was talking to him about this. And they're doing the right things on paper, but we really need to see if they're going to do the right things in reality.
Excellent. We thank you so much for being on today. And additionally, we thank you for the work that you do. If you can tell our listeners how they can follow up with you, watch you, become abreast of the things that you're doing.
Yes. So my show is Monday through Friday, 7:30 p.m. on HBO. All of our segments, every correspondent and reporter on the show, all of our segments are online, YouTube, up for free. You can look up my work under my name, Antonia Hylton, and all of my social handles are the same. Hylton26. Follow me, tweet me, ask me questions about what I do. I'm always happy to engage with folks and to continue the conversation, especially on subjects as important as this one.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much for your time today. And we hope that you would remain a friend of the show.
I certainly will. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
You too now.
YouTube, YouTube, Facebook Live, IntellectualRadio.com, whatever you're listening to, we hope that you enjoyed the show today. We hope that we were able to give you some information you found insightful and useful and edifying. I love this, Dave.
They need to come out with a 3 strikes and you're out for police officers across the country. We need to. I mean, because we do a really good job at policing our citizens. We do a very poor job at policing the police. If you had a 3 strikes and you're out nationwide law for police officers, where if you commit the 3rd type of an offense, you automatically do 25 years. One of 3 things would happen. Bad apples would stop joining the force. Bad apples would either quit the force when they get their 2nd offense, or they'd go to jail.
There you go. We got to do something.
Yeah, we can't continue with this. Every time someone says, well, all police aren't bad. As soon as you say that, you do a disservice to every innocent person who is sitting in jail because of bad policemen.
We thank you so much for joining us today. Again, time is against us, so we have to get out of here. We thank our producer, Breon Jones, for producing another wonderful show. We thank Mr. Earl Winfrey, and of course, we thank our audience for joining us today on Humanity in the Headlines, and we certainly thank our guest, Antonia Hylton. We'll be back next week. Thank you so much for watching and listening to Humanity in the Headlines. Everybody have a blessed and safe week. Take care.